So for the format for this session is 3 presentations followed by a panel discussion and questions and answers. By the way, apologies, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Grant Fitzner, Chief Economist at the Office for National Statistics. Hoping we get some good questions, so do have a think about them. And of course, you can kind of wait till we get to the Q&A, or if you want to, you can go onto Slido and ask questions there. Over to you, John.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for coming. Welcome. I hope this will prove to be an interesting and useful session for you. As Grant says, we're focusing in the whole session on the use of linked employer-employee data for economic measurement, and in particular measurement of the labour market. So I'm presenting the first paper here, New Insights on Labour Market Dynamism from UK Linked Employer-Employee Data. My name's John Forth. I work at Bayes Business School at City University. And this is a joint collaboration between ESCoE and the Office for National Statistics. So my colleague in ESCoE, Alex Bryson, and within the ONS, we've been working with Johannes Lemmer and Kyle Jones from the Economic Microdata Transformation team, both of whom are here. And I must also give credit to Christina Palmu, who worked with us in a previous stage of this project and provided a lot of the foundation, really, for what we're now able to do. So in case you're not familiar with linked employer-employee data, let me just give you a quick primer. What are we talking about here? We're talking about data which links workers to firms and which tracks those workers and those firms over time. So in the graphic here, you see an illustration, 3 different employers, different employees nested within those employers. And the data we're creating allows us to track both the firms and the workers within those firms over time. So, for instance, we can track individual employees and see how their earnings progress from one period to the next during a career within a firm. We can also track those workers as they move to different firms, seeing, for instance, how their earnings grow over that period. And this kind of data structure is a very useful analytical tool in its own right. At the firm level, it allows you to measure and understand which firms are hiring in the economy. If you think about the worker level, what happens to employees' earnings and career prospects when they move from one firm to another. And also, how does the movement of workers across firms benefit, let's say, firm productivity in terms of the spread of innovation, for example. You can also use this kind of firm-worker spine for onward linkage. So you have the possibility maybe to add data on skills on the employee side or business productivity on the firm side. And then the other thing you can do with this kind of spine is use it as a sampling frame for future surveys. And that's a particular interest of mine. Not that I'm going to say very much about that today. A word then briefly about our collaboration between ONS and ESCoE. There are many countries, some of whom are represented here today, who have a comprehensive linked employer-employee data infrastructure. And when I say a comprehensive infrastructure, I mean one which covers pretty much the universe of all employees. So Canada would be one such example, examples in France, and we'll hear about that shortly, and in many other OECD countries, and Alex Hijzen will talk a bit about that in the third paper. So many countries have that kind of comprehensive lead infrastructure. Historically, the UK hasn't. Alex and I have been trying to make the case for the UK to invest more in linked employer-employee data for a long while. Alex and I organised a conference back in 2006 with the Department of Trade and Industry, where we tried to present a number of use cases. If you then trace back the more recent ONS use of LEAD, I think you can trace it back in some sense to the Bean Review, arguing for greater use of admin data. If we then look at the practical steps that were taken, HMRC, the tax office, initially began to share payroll data with the ONS in around 2019, 2020. What that payroll data contains is individual payment submissions. So if you work in the UK and you're working for an employer, every time that employer pays you, that payment record goes to the tax office, to HMRC. They then gather all of those data items together, and with the ONS have built a data set which allows you to track individuals' employment histories and their earnings. Alex and I published a roadmap for how one could use those data to create a linked employer-employee data set for statistical and research use back in June of last year with Christina Palmu. The permissions to link those PAYE data to the IDBR to effect the link between the workers and the firms, that came through in November 25. And we're now, with Kyle and Johannes, building a LINKLEED prototype and beginning to scope out how it can be used for economic measurement. So that's the genesis, really, or the basis of this ESCoE project. And we're scoping out two particular uses that I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, the way in which the LINKLEED can be used as a quality assurance tool for existing labour market statistics that are based on surveys. So using admin data to help us quality assure certain survey estimates, workforce jobs, and average weekly earnings. And then secondly, using the data to create new statistics, in particular on worker flows and earnings dynamics. And in the future, we have the ambition to make these data available more widely for research use. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two uses briefly. Firstly, just a little window a bit more into what the data set looks like that we've been creating. If you start over on the right-hand side with the light green box, these are the PAYE RTI returns, the payment submissions. And the ONS's data development unit take those payment records and from them create a monthly data set identifying employees in PAYE employment, their employment start and end dates, and their earnings in each month. So you have a monthly record of an employee's earnings. Those employee records are organized by PAYE scheme. And so in order to aggregate employees and connect them to firms, we use a spine that was created during the generation of the longitudinal business database, and that links PAYE schemes to IDBR business reference numbers, so enterprise reference numbers. So that means we have employees nested within enterprises. So the coverage is all payrolled employees linked to the IDBR enterprises that employ them. In terms of numbers, that's around 30 million employees in around 2 million firms. We have these data for 2014 through to 2025. The frequency is monthly, and we have identifiers for the workers and the firms. The data is not very wide, so there are not many variables in the data set, but the big power of the data set is in workers being nested in firms and having that at high frequency and obviously with a high N. So I talked about two specific use cases that we've been exploring. Let me say first about the opportunity to use these data to support the production of existing statistics. Because LINKLEED gives us this consistent longitudinal framework that captures workers and employers, it means it's particularly useful if we want to try and quality assure ONS business surveys, so surveys of employers that the ONS conducts, where they're asking those employers about their workers. And so two particular examples. So ONS runs a series of short-term employment surveys. In those surveys, they contact around 37,000 businesses on a quarterly basis and ask them how many people they employ. And that information goes into the ONS's quarterly workforce jobs estimates. The second example is the monthly wages and salaries survey, where the ONS each month contact around 9,000 businesses, ask them about the size of their total payroll, and that information informs average weekly earnings. So if we take those two in turn, we've been starting to explore the use of LINKLEED to quality assure some of the survey data that's coming back. Now, I should say What I'm talking about today is extremely early work. It's very much developmental work. None of this is final. The point of presenting it here is to start to get some of your own feedback around what we're doing and maybe other use cases that we could employ. So with that caveat, let me show you something on the short-term employment survey. So what we're doing here is taking those 37,000 businesses that respond to the short-term employment survey and connecting their their STES responses with what we see about those businesses in the LINKLEED dataset. And we can make a comparison then between the employment they report in the STES and the number of employees we see in the LINKLEED. What we find is that in aggregate, the private sector employee jobs estimates from LINKLEED quite closely track those produced from or emerging from the STES. So on the right-hand side, the green dashed line is the employment estimate that you get from the STES for private sector jobs. The dark blue line is at the top is the total number of workers that we would count in those firms in the LINKLEED dataset. You'll see that's a good bit higher. But one of the reasons, or the main reason for that difference, is that the short-term employment surveys ask employers to report on employment at a specific date in the year. And the blue line in the LINKLEED is looking at their employment across the whole month. So when we try and refine that measure and take it down to the same date as is covered in the STES, you'll see we get the light blue line, which is a very close correspondence. So what we're able to do then is to compare what's coming out of the STES with what we see in the LINKLEED. It matches well in aggregate. There are a large proportion of firms where the data match exactly at the firm level, but there's also a distribution. As you'd expect, you get some firms where the STES estimate is higher than the LINKLEED and some where it's lower. It's pretty much normally distributed around zero, but there is a distribution. Now that might lead you to think, well, do you need the STES? Why not just use the LINKLEED? Well, you can't make that leap because there's good quality information in the STES that you can't get from the LINKLEED dataset. So for instance, the STES asks the firm about its full-time, part-time breakdown. There's no good hours information in the linked employer-employee data. So the STES does certainly offer us something additional. But where we think the LINKLEED can be useful is in cross-checking some of the returns that come back through the short-term employment survey. So maybe employment changes reported in the STES look different to what we're seeing in the LINKLEED, and that would give us the trigger perhaps to dig into those survey responses in a bit more detail, understand where the discrepancies are coming from, and that can support more quality assurance of the survey statistics. Perhaps it points to misreporting or misclassification. So it's a trigger for further investigation. Similar approach using the earnings statistics from the monthly wages and salaries survey. So here in the chart on the right, the green line, sorry, let me backtrack. The monthly wages and salaries survey surveys around 9,000 businesses. The green line is the pattern of average weekly earnings for total pay from MWSS. If you find those 9,000 firms in the LINKLEED dataset and look at what the LINKLEED dataset reports on their earnings, you'll see again, you get a very close correspondence. So I think all of this is helping to boost some of our confidence in the quality of the survey statistics because we're able to see a very similar pattern in admin data. Again, the earnings don't match perfectly for all firms, but you do get, obviously you see a normal distribution around zero. As with the short-term employment survey, the LINKLEED isn't a perfect substitute for the survey here because the survey collects additional information that you can't find in the LINKLEED data. For instance, the share of wages that's attributable to bonuses and so on. So average weekly earnings has a regular pay series, which you can't well replicate in the LINKLEED. But again, we can use the administrative LINKLEED data to help us identify unusual movements in the survey, which we might then want to further investigate, and the survey teams might then want to dig into a little bit more. The other benefit of the LINKLEED data set in this particular case is that monthly wages and salaries survey doesn't survey any firms with fewer than 20 employees. But the LINKLEED data set covers all employees in all firms. So whereas at the moment, average weekly earnings for those small firms uses an adjustment factor from the ASH, here in LINKLEED, we'd be able to get an earnings estimate directly for those small firms. Okay, so two illustrations of how these kind of data, now they're in development, might be able to support the production of existing statistics, help support the economic statistics plan by building our confidence and trust in some of the existing series. Let me say a word then about how we're thinking about using LINKLEED to develop new statistics, which perhaps aren't currently in existence. So in particular, one of the main uses that you see here in other countries is using statistics on worker flows to help improve our ability to track labour market conditions. So some of the early work done in the US by Steve Davis, John Holtivanger, Julia Lane, they began using firm-level surveys and creating measures of job creation and job destruction by looking at whether firms were expanding or contracting. And the UK has that kind of firm-level data. You will see a business dynamism publication by the ONS, based on the longitudinal business database. Longitudinal business database. So we have that firm-level data. But what researchers in the US then went on to do was to use linked employer-employee data to measure all of the worker flows. So no longer just looking at whether firms were expanding or contracting, but also looking at all the flows of workers into and out of firms. So capturing all of the worker reallocation around the labour market. And why might this be useful? Well, here's a quote from the 2025 ONS Labour Market Overview. Feedback from our vacancy survey suggests some firms may not be recruiting new workers or replacing workers who've left. With the LINKLEED dataset, you can measure this kind of hiring activity directly. So we're currently using the LINKLEED to develop some new experimental statistics, complementing or in some senses perhaps replacing or augmenting what's already available from the LFS or the longitudinal business database. So hires, separations, job-to-job flows, that's movements between firms. We can start to think about worker-level decompositions of earnings growth. We can start to think about the link between worker flows and productivity growth. If you've used the US data, you'll perhaps be familiar with this kind of interface where you can look at job-to-job flows at a very granular detail. So just to show you a little bit about what those data start to look like, here I'm showing a time series on hires and separations from the UK LINKLEED. If we start at the bottom, the green line is hires, so this is people entering a new job from non-employment. And then the light blue line are people who are moving job, being hired by a different firm. The red line at the bottom are separations, so people leaving a job, going into non-employment. And then the dark blue line are separations to another employer. So necessarily a job-to-job move involves a separation paired with a hire, so that's why the dark blue line precedes the light blue one by one period. They're two sides of the same coin. So just to give you a couple of illustrations of what we can start to do then with some of this raw material on hires and separations and job-to-job flows, one thing we can start to do is capture some of what we might call the missing dynamism that you don't see in firm-level data like the longitudinal business database. So the blue line at the bottom is the net job creation rate that would be measured in the LBD, and you'd see that in the ONS publication on business dynamism. It's essentially capturing all the hiring that's going on in growing firms. So what I'd call expansionary hiring. In the LINKLEED dataset, we can not only capture the expansionary hiring, but we can also capture the replacement hiring. So instances where somebody departs the firm and the firm hires to fill that spot, even though total employment doesn't increase. So we're capturing a lot more of the reallocation of workers around the labour market, and that green line at the top is what we might call the gross job creation rate, all of the hiring in the economy. If we index those series, you'll see they actually follow a similar trend, but what you'll notice is that the green line from the LINKLEED dataset precedes the blue line from the LBD as the economy started to come out of the recession after COVID. And what's happening there is that replacement hiring picks up more quickly than expansionary hiring as you come out of recession. So the LINKLEED gives us more of a leading indicator of when the economy is starting to pick up after a shock. So we can start with these worker flow data to capture some of the dynamics in the labour market which might be invisible in firm level data. We can do that with more granularity than you can do, let's say, with a workforce survey like the LFS. And of course, you can start to generate some of these estimates at the firm level. So which firms are hiring and which are not. The other thing is to measure some of the worker reallocation across firms, if you like, from a worker perspective. So what we're showing here is the job-to-job flow rate in the economy. So the percentage of all worker movements that involve a job-to-job hire. The dark blue line is the series you'd already be able to extract from the LFS that's published on the ONS website. In the light green line, we replicate a job-to-job flow rate from the LINKLEED dataset. Two particular advantages. One, the LINKLEED dataset's more regular, so we can generate monthly estimates rather than the quarterly ones that come from the LFS. And also, because we've got such a much larger dataset, we can start to chart these job-to-job flow rates for very detailed industries to get more of a detailed picture of what's going on in particular parts of the economy. Now, one of the main interests for economists in this kind of job mobility rate is the extent to which people are moving around the labour market and able to improve their earnings, because we know this kind of job mobility is a key way in which employees achieve wage growth as they go through time. And you can see that the job mobility fell dramatically during the COVID pandemic, so that job mobility really stalled. The other thing, of course, you need to know is that as people move around the labour market, which firms are they moving from and to? And that's the other part of the picture. And so on this slide, what we're looking at is conditional on a worker moving from one firm to another, what's the probability that they move from a lower wage firm to a higher wage firm? So if you like, that's the other part of the job ladder. One part of the job ladder is what's the probability that somebody is able to move to a new job, and the other part is what's the probability that that move actually enables them to move up the distribution of firms. What you'll see here is that that series is actually pretty flat through time. So to the extent that the job ladder in the UK stalled through the pandemic, it's largely as a result of the decline in overall job reallocation rather than a big change in the types of moves that were possible. Obviously, the series is quite noisy. We're charting it here at very high frequency, but the light blue line there in the middle is a smoothed average, and you see that's fairly flat. So just to summarize and bring us to a close. So we've had this ONS ESCoE collaboration to try and really improve the use of LINKLEED for the measurement of the labour market, and I think we've made a good amount of progress in the last 12 months, particularly thanks to Christina, Kyle and Johannes for really fantastic work within the ONS. What we've done is be able to create this LINKLEED prototype, and it's now starting to enter regular production within the ONS. That's still very much in early stages, but we're now starting to use it in earnest. So I think, in some sense, the power of admin data is being realized in this space. We've been doing some coherence work with the STAIRS and the MWSS. That's still in progress, but we're beginning to create workflows that will have, I think, and lead to improvements in statistical production, supporting the Labour Market Statistics Transformation Plan. We're now starting to develop some experimental statistics on hires, separations, and the job-to-job flows. They're still undergoing some quality assurance, but we would hope to start producing some of those statistics in the next few months. So next steps. One of the next steps is refining our methodology for apportioning employees across business units. So there's not very good information in the LINKLEED data about exactly which work site an employer works at. So we've got some methodological work to try and fully allocate workers to individual work sites, and that will improve our industry disaggregation and, of course, allow us to do some spatial work. And looking for opportunities to link to business tax data, trade data, and employee data. Obviously, other people are way ahead of us here. So Arno is presenting on Thursday morning on the Business Worker Register. They've already done a lot of these linkages. So do go and see his presentation if you're available. We're now looking to do some of that within the ONS. And then I think in the future, potential to use this lead spine as a sampling frame, giving us an ability maybe to do linked surveys of workers and firms to try and understand more about the black box of what's going on within firms, to understand productivity growth and so on, the human side of productivity. That's where we'd like to go in the future. Okay, thank you. If you'd like to follow the project, the QR code on the left will take you to our project page on the ESCoE website, and that's my LinkedIn page on the right, and I'll post updates through there when they're available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Aliette.
Our next speaker is Aliette Cheptitski from INSEE to talk about the French lead. Actually, sorry, the co-presentation, I should say. We're just getting the slides up now. And apologies, we are running a little bit over time, so let's see how the next presenters go. I think we are planning on posting these presentations on the ESCoE website as well for people who kind of want to have another look. Over to you.
Hi everyone. So we're both from INSEE. I'm Aliette Cheptitski, and I'm working on the all employee database, and I'm mainly responsible for the private sector and the production of the database.
And I'm Lino Galliena. I'm working on the public sector side.
And so we're going to present to you how INSEE and the French official statistical system is using our lead data, which is the Déclaration Sociale Nominative, or the DSN data. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the DSN is and how it can be used. Then Lino will talk about some challenges and opportunities in using that data and focus on the public sector as an example of a recent shift to the DSN. And then I'll also give a case study on combining the DSN with some survey data. So first of all, what is the DSN and how it can be used? So shortly, a little bit back in time, before the 1970s, we had three types of sources for estimating labor market statistics. We had the census, which gave us information on jobs from individual declarations. So it wasn't focused on the labor market, first of all. It was exhaustive, but it was only every few years, so maybe every 7 years on average. We also had the labor force surveys, so that gave us information on jobs from individual declarations, and it was every year, but of course it was a sample. And then we had the enterprise surveys, so those were also every year, but very sector-oriented, especially on the industrial sector, and only aggregated information on jobs. So in the 1970s, we had a first step of using administrative data and trying to regroup sources, so fiscal and social declaration with the DAS, which was furthered in the 1980s with the DADS. And there were also some other declarations that were used by the Labour Ministry, so the DMMO, that was for firms that had more than 50 salaries. And they also complemented that with the EMMO, which was a small survey for smaller firms, basically, with less employees. And since the 2010s, we have now the DSN, which has been integrated since 2018 for the private sector and since 2022 for the public sector. So what is the DSN? Basically, the idea is to tell us once about all this information. So it replaces multiple redundant information with a single monthly standardized digital submission. The scope it covers is all employers and all employees, and is streamlining data for social security, tax, and statistical agencies. It's important that the data goes to those users, especially social security and tax administration, because it determines also the quality of the data. Some variables, the ones that are used by those administrations, will be of a better quality compared to other variables that are not used by those administrations. So it's like survey, you can have some declaration issues in the data. And the legal framework is that French law enables us at INSEE to access this administrative data for statistical purposes. So the way it works is that we have as a foundation this idea of upstream quality and also governance involvement directly at INSEE. So how it works is that there is this exchange framework that is mostly a technical manual that is updated annually and is both for directed at the employers that are going to declare and also at the users, so INSEE and the administration, that are going to receive the data. And basically it defines the data model, the message structure, and the exchange kinematics. And it ensures clarity and uniformity across all stakeholders. So there are some automated controls about the structure, the syntax, the consistency, and some other checks that are performed before the data even reaches INSEE. The reason for that is also that some of this data is used for to compute taxes, for instance, or to determine the rights for pensions. So it's quite important data in that regard and has to be correctly declared. Other quality checks are added by INSEE as well to enable a more reliable statistical process. And so we also have this active participation by INSEE in the DSN governance bodies to better understand collection and control phases and address our statistical needs. So for instance, if we notice in the data that there are some frequent errors in declarations for some firms, we can communicate that information to the governance bodies, and they will try to rectify that if it's a big enough error. So this is quite a big figure, but basically the way it works at INSEE is it feeds in a complex system. So in green, you have all the administrative data that feeds into the system. So on the top, you have the DSN, but you also have some other data to complement it on, for example, employees of individual employers or on self-employed persons. And you also have this survey on the structure of earnings and labor costs. Then this feeds into both two kinds of statistics, structural statistics, that's all the rectangles in blue. And so you have the all-employee statistical database that is going to feed mostly the all-employee longitudinal panel. You also have the self-employee statistical database, for instance, that is also going to feed into a panel, and those panels together are the longitudinal panel for all people in activity. And the second part is the orange rectangles, so it's the short-term statistics, and you have some estimates that are co-produced by INSEE, the Social Administration, and also the Ministry of Labor, the Department of Statistics at the Ministry of Labor, to produce quarterly estimates with this DSN data. And then it feeds also into some wage and labor cost indices, for instance. So it's used very widely, basically, in INSEE.
Thank you. So I'm gonna be fast on this part because we will have occasion to speak more about challenges and well, opportunities regarding the way we use DSN. But well, just to say something to you. Well, the first challenge is technical. I mean, at INSEE, we are not the first administration to get access to the data. You have the Social Security Administration that receives the data. It curates it a little bit for us, meaning mostly removing some variables. We just have the set of variables we asked. So instead of hundreds, we've got a little 100 variables. And then we receive that. But even this streamed data is a bigger challenge because, well, these are something like 20 million employees declaration, so it's huge. It's probably the second largest data we receive at INSEE, the first one being scanner data from CPI. And so we needed to have pipelines big enough to receive that, and then IT application, computation power enough to handle this kind of data set. So it's been quite a challenge when we started to work, and it still is. The second challenge is about, and opportunities about concepts. So I'm gonna come back to that. Regarding challenge in conceptual opportunities, in fact, this kind of data set is more is giving us access to more direct data we had beforehand. Well, we have more information. We've got many variables. We've got it faster, and we've got it closer from what we expect. With monthly data, for instance, we can have flash estimates. I mean, that's one of the aspects we have with DSN. With Aliette, we're not working that much with flash estimates because we are on the structural part, but we have lots of colleagues that are using the DSN a few weeks after the declaration for measuring employment evolution. Then we go with Aliette by consolidating them using potential additional information to get it ready for structural analysis, for also zooming more on this data, for instance, for zooming more on establishments. So in the end, we produce the so-called all employees database, base tous salariés in French. It's yearly data, exhaustive data on public, private sector, where we've collected lots of information that are useful for researchers, for instance, on wages and on the composition of wage, but also on hours. So we put a lot of work to go from declaration to this database. But it's not the only product we do in our department, because as Aliette said, we also have labor cost survey, and so we use VDSN also to complement or sometimes reduce number of questions in the labor cost survey. But Aliette will talk to you a little bit more on that. I will zoom more on the public sector, which is my side of the production of the all salaries database. So basically, as Aliette said, we had a long history with administrative data. We had something like more than 20 years of administrative data. But before 2009, we received it from many sources. In 2009, we started to have DADS, one of the acronym Aliette gave you, which was first annual database based on the different sides of the public sector. And then we built our statistics regarding this data source. So we started to publish lots of information regarding hospital civil servants, state civil servants, for instance, teachers in France, but also local civil servant, because we had a good precision thanks to that data set. It's also helped us to build a unified database and concept of employment in France to account, for instance, for multi-activity. For instance, someone from private sector that comes and gives some classes in a university. We account for that to avoid to double counting him in employment statistics. So it's been, a big harmonization phase. And then came the earthquake of going to DSN. DSN, so it's replacing an administrative source by another one, but it had some transition costs because the concepts were different from different data providers. We went to a unique one. But we went after the private sector. We went something like 5 years. So we had the chance to to encounter some of the issues they had 5 years before, but we encountered new issues, in particular regarding working hours, because in France, civil servants, they have lifetime employment. So basically, unemployment declarations are not reliable. I mean, variables that will be useful for unemployment are not used by social security administrations, and so administrations that declared these variables did not do a very good job. We think about 20% of the data set is not reliable regarding working hours. Working hours are the basis for unemployment benefits. But the chance we had is that we could use the same pipeline they adopted in private sector with 5 years delay, meaning building in the same IT chain. We have lots of application to handle this big data set, and we could, in public sector, accelerate transition thanks to that.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what John mentioned earlier in the first presentation. So what it can be used with is both using the DSN to match with other sources, and especially with regard to surveys. So some quick examples of what you can do with the DSN is, first of all, match the administrative data with the labor force survey. So it can help us to understand some discrepancies. It was the case at the beginning of the 2020 to 2023. We noticed quite an increase in the gap between the survey and the administrative data, and we were able to compare the two sources together individually, and we could see where the difference came from. So, for instance, different declarations on apprentices, on workers that were aged 60 or more, or what we call micro-entrepreneurs. Another interesting use of the DSN is to match employees with independent workers or self-employed workers. And so this allows us to adjust employment data for multiple job holding. Then we can also have some projects outside of INSEE, of course. And one of them would be the Ministry of Higher Education using that data to match it with the student data. And this allows them to study the professional integration of graduates for each university and each degree with quite a lot of details to look at how they enter the job market soon after graduation and also the effect on wages. Another example that I can mention quickly is, of course, the Labor Ministry and the Statistical Service there. So they also had this DMMO and EMMO that I mentioned earlier that they used to measure job flows, and they basically replaced those sources with the DSN. So that was also quite a big transition that they accomplished. And they also have some projects that allows them to link the administrative data with other data. In this case, that would be unemployment records and unemployment insurance records, and also social security data. And they created this framework especially to evaluate a reform of the unemployment insurance system that happened recently. In collaboration with researchers. So a case that I will talk a little bit more is an internal case that we had. So I mentioned earlier two surveys that we have, which are the SES, Structure of Earnings Survey, and Labor Cost Survey, the LCS. And we were able to use the DSN directly to see what we could basically find in the data that was comparable with the surveys, and whether it was possible to, first of all, extend the coverage of this data to micro enterprises, so enterprises with less than 10 employees, and also partly substitute the DSN data when it was possible to reduce the response burden on the respondents. And the results were that, and this was done also in the framework of Eurostat, collaboration with the Eurostat framework. And so for micro enterprises, this was quite successful in the sense that all the information that was required by Eurostat was available, directly or indirectly. So we were able to extend the survey in that way. And also for the SES and the LCS, we were able to reduce the number of questions in the employee section quite extensively. And for the SES, there was also another establishment section that was removed altogether. So a conclusion maybe, so what's coming soon for us with the DSN. So first of all, with the end of the public sector coming to the DSN as well, we've had a stabilization of our processes, but we're still consolidating them and improving the documentation. We're also still aiming to reduce further the distribution times. The target that we have is basically 1 year after the data is finished, declared for 1 year. And also we have a question that's very important to us about national identification numbers, because we have a project which is called the Brazil project to centralize at INSEE how we manage those identification numbers and how we use them to basically link all sorts of data together. We also have some issues about coverage, so we want to extend the statistics to the territory of Mayotte. And there are some, of course, developing uses for public policy monitoring purposes. And there's a committee that was set up in that sense by the body responsible for the DSN, and that we joined. And maybe I can just say a word about another administrative source that we're currently exploring, which is the PASRO. It's basically complementary data. It's very promising. Collects monthly data on non-wage income. So it's pensions for retirees and employment benefits, sickness benefits, other types of social benefits. And the idea is to use it as a complement to the DSN to better understand, so when the employment is combined with retirement, for example, or with social benefits, and also to use it in the longitudinal tracking of people in work and understand what happens to them when they're not working. So that's it.
our third and final speaker, Alexander Hijzen from the OECD. And firstly, I should apologise that we're running over time. I'm hoping we have an opportunity for at least one or two questions to the panel once Alexander's wrapped up, if people don't mind staying back for a few minutes. Thank you.
Is it? No, it's not it.
Have you got the clicker?
Oh, sorry.
Pass it.
Give that back.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this session on linked employee data, which is a topic that's close to my heart. So my name is Alexander Hijzen. I'm a senior economist at the OECD, and I'm leading the OECD LINKLEED 2.0 project, which seeks to promote cross-country research and policy analysis using linked employee data. And so as part of this initiative, we have been looking at many different questions, job displacement, gender wage gaps, migration, starting to look at AI. But today I'd like to talk about job mobility because it connects very closely to the presentation by John, and it gives a bit of an idea of what else you could do in this domain. The work I'll present today is based on a chapter that was published as part of last year's Employment Outlook and is entitled Reviving Growth in a Time of Workforce Aging, the Role of Job Mobility. So the starting point of the analysis is that productivity growth has weakened and become less inclusive. So since the late 1990s, labor productivity growth has more than halved on average across OECD countries. Average wage growth has failed to keep up even with weak productivity growth, particularly among low-wage workers. And so it's a complicated, but to some extent this reflects the difficulty of firms and workers to adapt to rapid and profound structural change in the context of workforce aging. And indeed, it's possible that workforce aging, because of its implications for learning and mobility, has made it even harder to adjust to structural change at a time when the need for adaptability is particularly high, raising important questions for governments. So in this chapter, we're particularly interested in the role that job mobility can play in reviving aggregate wage and productivity growth. So job mobility can contribute to stronger aggregate growth by promoting a more efficient allocation of jobs across firms that differ in their productivity or wage-setting practices, while at the same time support structural transformation and alleviate labor shortages. However, workforce aging may to some extent undermine this process. Older workers tend to be less mobile, reducing the potential contribution of growth-enhancing reallocation for reviving aggregate growth. So in this chapter, we want to understand better what is the role of workforce aging for aggregate wage and productivity growth by focusing specifically on its role for growth-enhancing reallocation. And so to this end, we look at three sub-questions, if you like. We start by documenting how does growth-enhancing reallocation take place. Is it mainly a voluntary process? Is it involuntary? How important is this process for aggregate wage and productivity growth? And how is this process affected by workforce aging? Before getting to this question, I'd like to show a few stylized facts to motivate a little bit further the analysis. This I basically mentioned. So this shows aggregate data across OECD countries to show that productivity growth has weakened and become less broadly shared. So I'll skip that because we're running out of time. This is a little bit more interesting. So what's going on? So from a statistical perspective, a decline in aggregate wage and productivity growth could reflect weaker growth within firms related to the pace of innovation, technology adoption, skill development, or a change in growth between firms due to the pace of job reallocation. And so to get a first indication of the importance of the second channel, this slide documents job reallocation as measured by the importance of job creation and job destruction. So by looking at job reallocation between declining and expanding firms. And so it shows that in the countries in which we have suitable data available, that job relocation has been declining. So it's the case in the US on the left, but also in other countries, including the UK. And so to the extent that high productivity firms are more likely to expand and low productivity firms are more likely to decline, a decline in the pace of gross job relocation might have contributed to the slowdown in aggregate productivity. So let's pause for a second. What does that mean? And so why would this be the case? So is this because there's a reduced need for job relocation or because it has become more costly? In principle, both are possible. We don't think it's very likely that there is reduced need for job relocation given the very fast pace of structural transformation, the rise in productivity dispersion that we observe in many countries. So we believe this is more likely to be related to the cost of job relocation, which might be related to the cost for employers to adjust employment in response to changing business conditions, or it may be related to the cost to workers to changing firms. And the cost for workers may reflect many different factors, but one of them might be workforce aging to the extent that job mobility is more costly for older workers. So this slide attempts to provide an indication of the role of workforce aging for overall job mobility, so the sum of all hires and separations in employment. And it does so by looking at the changes in the age structure of employment, the actual changes or the projected ones up to 2060, and applying this to the differences, so the age structure of employment across age groups, and applying this to the different rates of mobility for each age group as we observe them in 2017. And so the main message is that this changing composition of employment across age groups because of workforce aging has induced a reduction in the rate of overall job mobility. So that's the dotted line. And the second main message is that this is mainly driven by job-to-job mobility. So direct transitions between firms from one year to the next, which we tend to think about as being mostly voluntary. By contrast, workforce aging does not have much of an effect on employment mobility, the light blue line. And so this refers to transitions in and out of employment, which may reflect a variety of factors, the risk of unemployment, but also the decision to participate in the labor force. And so these results imply that clearly older workers are less mobile, but also less likely to change jobs voluntarily. And as we'll see in a bit, it's exactly this channel of job mobility that's particularly important for growth-enhancing relocation. So let me now move to the actual empirical analysis. So this is based on linked employment data for 17 OECD countries, not including the UK, unfortunately, for approximately the period 2000-2019. So this slide documents the process of job relocation by basically documenting employment growth along the employment-weighted distribution, firm distribution of wages and productivity. So what you see is that in high-performance firms, so firms with high productivity or high wages, employment growth is consistently higher than in low productivity and low wage firms. So this indicates that employment is continuously being relocated from lower productivity firms and lower wage firms to higher productivity firms, higher wage firms, contributing to aggregate wage and productivity growth. The second takeaway from this slide is that it is largely driven by job-to-job mobility, the dark blue part. So direct transitions between firms, which we refer to as a job ladder, as John also did, and reflects the process through which workers advance in their careers by changing jobs. So what does this mean for aggregate wage and productivity growth? So this slide provides a decomposition of aggregate wage and productivity, wage and productivity growth, essentially within and between firms. So within firms by following the wages and productivity of workers who stay in the same firm, and between firms, the change in wages and productivity because of the process of job relocation between firms that differ in their productivity and wage-setting practices. And so the first observation to make is that job-to-job mobility, the job ladder, is a very important source of aggregate wage and productivity growth. So on average across countries and over the time period, it contributes almost 1 percentage point to aggregate growth. But a significant part of this is offset by employment mobility, which has a negative contribution. And this reflects the role of life cycle or cohort effects. So younger workers enter employment, the labor force, into relatively low wage, low productivity firms. Older workers move out of higher wage, higher productivity firms, giving rise to a negative contribution to productivity growth. Taking the two components together, we observe that job reallocation contributes 0.3 percentage points to average annual wage and productivity growth, which is about 20% of the total. So it's not the main source of aggregate growth, but it's an important source of aggregate growth. Growth-enhancing job relocation and the job ladder is also important for understanding cross-country differences in growth performance. So we estimate that about half of the cross-country variation of our 17 countries is explained by differences in the importance of growth-enhancing relocation, and about half of that, so a quarter of the total, by the job ladder. So in other words, in countries with high growth, high wage growth in this case, such as Estonia, Hungary, Lithuania, these are countries that also have a very strong contribution of growth-enhancing relocation and an important job ladder. Whereas in countries with more sluggish labor markets, such as France, Belgium, and Italy, we observe the opposite. So let me now move to the role of workforce aging. So let me start again by documenting the process of growth enhancing relocation across age groups. So to do that, we focus on the correlation between employment growth on the one hand and firm quality on the other, where firm quality refers to average firm wages or productivity. So a stronger correlation, a higher bar, reflects a stronger process of growth-enhancing relocation. So we observe a very clear gradient. So the process of growth-enhancing relocation is much stronger for younger workers who are much more responsive to differences in working conditions across firms. And these differences across age groups are again mainly driven by the importance of the job ladder. So older workers are not just less likely to change jobs, they're also less likely to change to better jobs and to do so voluntarily. So why might this be the case? So changing jobs might be costly for older workers because they have family commitments, they bought a house. They may also have weaker incentives to do so because they're already well matched. They already climbed the job ladder, and and the benefits from changing jobs are more limited when you have fewer years left in your career. But irrespective of the reason, this suggests that workforce aging, by increasing the share of employment of older workers in the workforce, may have contributed to the slowdown in aggregate productivity growth. And so to look at that, this slide focuses on between-firm productivity growth, so the component related to growth-enhancing relocation, and then applies a shift-share decomposition across and within age groups. And so we focus on two components. We focus on the share component, so the dark blue component that's associated with changes in the structure of employment, the shift towards older workers, and the light blue component, which reflects differential shifts, so changes in the mobility behavior of older workers relative to younger workers. And so this might be relevant because of workforce aging, workers continue to work longer, and this might have an impact on their mobility behavior. So we take this into account as well. And so what we observe is that it's almost mechanically, right? So that what we observe is that workforce aging contributes negatively to the between component of wage and productivity growth. This is entirely driven by the compositional effects, so the shift of the employment structure toward older workers who are less mobile. To some extent, this is offset by the fact that older workers have become somewhat more mobile than younger workers, but that's not, I would say, it's a bit more variable across countries, so that's not fully robust, whereas the compositional story applies everywhere. To conclude, growth-enhancing job relocation is to a large extent driven by job-to-job mobility, the job ladder. It accounts for a substantial part of aggregate growth and also explains a significant part of the cross-country variation. Workforce aging has contributed to the slowdown in aggregate wage growth. I didn't mention that, so the effect is 0.1 of a percentage point. That might seem small, but given that productivity growth and wage growth was also very weak, it's still a non-negligible part of the total. In one sentence, the implications from a policy perspective. So if you want to revive aggregate wage and productivity growth through growth-enhancing relocation, it's important to not just provide sufficient flexibility to firms, which is something that the OECD has said for a long time and remains important, but it's particularly important to make sure that you support worker mobility opportunities for workers. So by removing policy-related barriers to job mobility, by making use of targeted interventions on, say, older workers who face particular barriers to job mobility, etc. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks for bearing with us. I'm going to ask the presenter to come up and also Bovill from the ONS and look forward to your questions. So, who's got the first question? Do we have any online? While you're thinking, oh, yes, we do. At the back. Okay. So while we're waiting, I'm going to ask the panel members, if there's one variable or statistic that you don't have available in your lead that you would love to have, what would it be? And I'm going to put Heather on the spot and asking her because she wasn't one of the presenters. Heather, what would you want?
Oh, just one. I think linked to the work that's been done already, the flow information, we get asked a lot by the bank for improved information on flows and what's happening. So I think that would be one thing that I'm really looking forward to seeing progress.
And our INSEE presenters?
Well, first I would like in my wish list one variable that is here but with better information is working hours. I think it's really important because we use it all along our process to normalize wages and we're imputing 20% of the day of the variables is quite a big work, so I would start from that.
And Alexander, from an OECD perspective?
So, I mean, with respect to the UK, I would say the main priority would be to make the data available to researchers so we can include the UK in our analysis as well. In terms of you know, the data itself, the main constraints we face in the work that we're doing are related to working time, which is key for the definition of hourly wages. So you cannot look at gender wage gaps without having information on working time. Occupations, super important for understanding how structural transformation takes place, how people change between jobs, and productivity. So I think these are some of the key things that we would like to have, but we do not always have.
Thank you. And we had a question at the back.
Hi. Sorry, this is Anisha from the Treasury. That was really interesting. And as the panelists said, I think hours and flows are probably are the most interesting parts of that. I was just wondering, I guess the missing piece in a lot of administrative labour market data is about the people not in work and the inactive population. And I think the second presentation sort of touched on it at the end, but are there any plans for how we could maybe use administrative benefits data or anything like that to kind of fill in some of that picture?
Who would like to
Pick
answer
that
that?
up? Yeah, so the lead data we've been building in the ONS is purely for payrolled employees. And I think that's a big step change for us to have comprehensive data on that part of the population. But as you say, there are other parts of the of employment and other parts of activity that we don't capture, and pushing into that would be certainly a goal of ours. So we would like to add self-assessment data in time, so we're able to cover self-employment, and then eventually to move into people who are not actually generating earned income. Now, the DWP has just dropped a data set in the Secure Research Service called RAPID, which does enable you to capture some of that activity of people who are not in work. And one might imagine a wonderful utopian future where we join all of these things up together. And I hope we will get there, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get to that point. So I think it's coming.
Would anyone else like to answer that?
Well, maybe I think for us, at INSEE at least, it would be the last data source that I talked about, the pass-through, that we want to use, that we've started receiving not too far in the past. And so, but there are already some initiatives, especially at the Health and Social Ministry and also the Labour Ministry, to look at trajectories of people, both combining employment and employment and also inactivity. So.
Thank you. Time for one more question and then we'll wrap up. I'll go for the gentleman at the back there.
Hello, my name is Stefan Ligdopoulos from Belmana here in London. My question primarily goes to Alexander. Given the OECD findings, as you were saying, that job-to-job mobility drives productivity growth, what metrics should governments prioritise when evaluating whether labour market reforms are actually improving productive mobility rather than increasing churn and precarity? The example I'll give to that is one of the countries in the OECD, Greece, has recently had a 6-day working week implemented. So how do you distinguish between longer working hours and this growth that is driven primarily by job-to-job mobility?
Right, that's a complicated question. So with all policies and all institutions and reforms, there are usually trade-offs that you want to take into account. So, somewhat, surprisingly, most labour market institutions are there to improve job quality, but we rarely look at job quality when we evaluate those policies. So, you really want, when it's a working time reform in Greece, or you want to evaluate a reform on its objectives, but also on its side effects. And so I would need to think what is exactly the link between this working time reform and job-to-job mobility, but maybe not the first thing I would be concerned about. I would think when you have a working time reform, so I wasn't aware of this reform, by the way, but if you go to against the trend and you increase the working week, I would be worried about the implications for productivity, because we know that if beyond a certain point, if people work too much, the marginal benefits of these additional hours tend to be lower. So I would be very much interested in the productivity effects of the reform, also on the well-being effects of the reform. And so it sounds a bit that this reform could maybe be counterproductive from a productivity perspective, and that it might be part of the.
Anyone else want to add? No? Okay.
No? I'm good.
Okay. Look, thanks for hanging in there, and we
go till 6, don't we, Grant?
Okay, 6. Yeah. My apologies. For some reason, I thought we were.
Unless I'm wrong.
In that case,
anyone shout me down if I'm wrong? But I think we go till 6.
My fault. In that case, we'll go for the question here and then at the front.
Did a good job.
Yeah, Bernard Casey. I used to work on age and employment at the OECD more years ago than probably Alexander would care to remember. But one of the things which was very evident at that time, and it relates to points which were made about covering dependent employment versus self-employment. One of the things that one saw was people in later stages of their working lives actually moving out of dependent employment into self-employment. Now that has an impact upon the business sector which is employing people. It has some impacts on the self-employment part of industry, well, of the economy, but then of particular sectors into the bargain. And I wonder whether you could comment upon what is happening there, because what are the implications if workers are becoming in some way less productive? And that is something which I used to argue about a lot as to what was actually meant by that. What kinds of things were they doing at one stage in their life, what time were they doing in others, and where were they doing it, in what form of employment?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. I think one thing I should have emphasized is that, of course, we focus only on dependent employment, but that was clear, I think, from your question. The second thing is that this chapter was part of an edition of the Employment Outlook that was fully dedicated to workforce aging. So this chapter really looks at a very partial aspect of it. And of course, there are many other factors that play a role, but we don't discuss it in this chapter, and some of these are discussed in the other chapters. And there is some discussion also in the literature on how productivity evolves over the life course. My reading of that literature is that it's actually not so clear. I think that there used to be an idea that older workers become less productive. I don't think there's a consensus on that. And indeed, if you start thinking about self-employment, so you change roles, older workers are often quite entrepreneurial, they start new businesses, and the productivity of that is difficult to measure in practice.
Thank you. We do actually have a question online, if I can read it. Okay, so question for the panel. What are the timelines for availability of ONS ESCoE data set? I knew someone would ask about the data set. Both published outputs and access to the data set for researchers. So I guess that's one for you, John, or Heather may want to come in as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, the data set we're building at the moment is a prototype. And we're able to build it because there are certain legal permissions that allow ONS researchers to work on that HMRC data. And those legal permissions aren't yet in a place where the data can be made more widely available. So we're trying to create a pathway through which that could happen. The timeline is not particularly clear on that. It's a matter of negotiation. So we're trying to push in that direction. You may be aware that Administrative Data Research have a call out at the moment called Better Economic Data, where they are also trying to work with HMRC to make these PAYE data more available for research. The timeline in their call is around about 18 months, 2 years would be their ambition. So I can't speak for our ONS ESCoE lead, but I think we would expect to see some of these PAYE data available in the research service within that kind of time frame. And I think, I mean, the other thing, of course, to say is that it's not just about getting the data out to academic researchers. There are many cross-government uses that can be made of these data, and that's something we're also trying to explore, as well as making the best use of it within the ONS to improve, other labour market statistics. So, yeah, we're pushing, but it can't be clear. It can't be clear exactly when it's going to be out. But certainly the early outputs that I've showed today will be available straight after the conference, and we will expect to put out some methodological and research papers in the next 6 months from the data set.
Thank you. Hi, Ben Heinrich. I'm Economist at Department of Science and Information Technology. Question for ONS colleagues. So we can't see occupation information yet in administrative data. Is that something that's on your radar? One way to that could proxy for this would be to link Leo data at company level. Is that something on your to-do list?
Yeah.
I'm going to start.
Yeah.
No, you can start.
Okay, I think the easier win there is to link the lead to census, which has occupation and education data, and that's something that can be done within the ONS a little bit more easily, I think, than the link to Leo. But all of these onward linkages are going to be part of the emphasis, I think, for all of us over the coming period. You can see from the French example some of the things they're able to do once they get these linkages together. You've seen that also in Canada. Everyone else is ahead of us, and we need to catch up for sure. And part of that, I think that the way of making that happen is to develop good use cases as to why the data need to be linked. That's part of the conversation around then ensuring that the legal gateways allow it to happen and getting the resource behind it, because none of this happens like magic. Yeah, so I think good use cases are part of the negotiation and conversation there, for sure.
I think just to add to that, there's the part about the underlying collection of the occupation data as well, which we're thinking about a lot. So we've been doing that linked to our Transform Labour Force survey, how you better collect occupation online, and then that will be used for thinking on census as well, so that then anything you onwardly link, hopefully the quality will be better as well.
Thank you. I think there's somebody up here that, yes, had a question.
Hello, Cleena Taylor, Head of Productivity at ONS. So I used to work in HMRC developing the RTI data. And I know in the process of making these data at the tax authority, there's actually quite a lot of processing that has to go into developing them and making them possible. And we very much had in mind at the time the use of them as longitudinal data. But there's always trade-offs. And it's just a point that a lot of these data sets are originally designed as one-off surveys, and the longitudinal linking of them sometimes comes afterwards. And therefore, I'm always a little, I'm always looking at results and thinking, are we just pulling out the assumptions that go into the creation of some of these data? In the process of either putting together your data sets or analysing them, is that forefront of your mind, and what sort of things are you looking out for when using these data to make sure that you're not just backing out some of the assumptions that are made in the data creation stage?
Thank you. Who would like to answer that?
Do you want to speak to how you've been looking at the longitudinal aspect of your data, or do you want me to start?
Maybe you can start.
I can start. So, okay, one of the things you see in the HMRC PAY RTI, once you start to look at it longitudinally, is obviously you have gaps in the data. People disappear. And then, of course, then you've got to make a judgment as to, has that person disappeared because they're no longer working for that employer? Maybe it's a seasonal job and they have a period off and then they come back, or does that mean that actually there's been some misreporting? And so in a lot of these lead data sets in different countries, you have to develop rules. And to a large extent, we're following some of what's been done in the US about how they treat short spells. So we have certain rules that somebody's allowed to disappear from the data set and come back after missing, let's say, a month. And we would count that as a continual spell, whereas if they disappear for maybe 3 months, that looks like a break. So you have to have some kind of rules. I think the key thing then is to ensure that those rules are transparent, so they can be criticised and evaluated, and other people might take different judgments. So that's one of the things we're really trying to emphasise with the ONS ESCoE lead, is for us to develop good metadata and user guides so people can understand what decisions have been made. And I think ONS and HMRC have done a very good job of that on the cross-sectional data that goes into employment and earnings statistics. It's pretty well laid out, some of the decisions they've made. What we need to do is to ensure that we also do that from the longitudinal dimension. Yeah, so I don't know if you've got any other experience from France on how that works.
Maybe I think the framework for us is a bit different, because for the structural data set at least, we aggregate the data into 1 year all at once. So for us, it's more the question of what unit we want to have in the data, whether it's salary, employees. The choice that we made was to have employees by firms, establishments. So basically, if someone disappears for a few months from, let's say, February to October, but still reappears in the same firm, we're going to count that as one line in the data set. But there are also some demands for further disaggregated data that we have to capture those movements for more temporary work or contracts that are shorter. So that's also something that we're trying to develop at the moment and offer some different data set to answer that need.
Alexander.
Yeah. We had a similar issue with this paper on job mobility because when we started this project, we were very much concerned about the role of data structure for the measurement of job mobility in different countries. So if you have mandatory employment surveys such as the ESCoE or the Quadros Pessoal in Portugal, you're going to measure something quite different from when you have spell data based on social security data, and particularly when you start aggregating things up to the annual level and you get some kind of time aggregation. So what we did is to take, for Austria, we have spell data, and so we can basically look at daily information, and we can mimic what we would get if we had, say, a point-in-time mandatory type linked employment period, and see to what extent this affected our results. And so it matters a lot for the relative importance of job-to-job and employment mobility and aggregate mobility, but when you're interested in relocation, which is more about net employment changes along the structure or the firm productivity distribution, it matters much less. So we were quite reassured and we felt comfortable with what we were doing.
So just to say briefly, one other way in which you can start to quality assure some of these longitudinal changes is by linking across to some of the surveys. So in Heather's team, they started to think about how they can link the PAYE data across to the LFS. And then, of course, you've got two views of what's happening to an individual as they move through time. And then you can compare and contrast. Yeah. So that's a good opportunity.
And I think it's worth saying that there's pros and cons of both the sources, isn't there? The survey sources and the admin sources. I think it's that comparing them and then explaining and caveating the limitations of each to build that understanding of what's happening in the labour market.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one. Christina.
Thank you. I'm super excited about this data set coming to life and the results. If I can ask sort of a policy question on kind of how this data I think is super powerful because it will answer things that we really need to know about the UK and we don't. And it's kind of a question also for INSEE and Alexander, if you've already looked at that, regarding one, heterogeneous rent sharing, and not just about how workers contribute to growth or benefit from growth, but which workers, which is something super powerful that administrative data like this will allow us to answer, and is becoming more and more and more policy relevant. You had sort of the AOC, you can't make $1 billion a couple of weeks ago. You have Zach Polanski in the UK talking about sort of what would it take to earn every minute to make as much as the 1%, etc. And then I guess second leg to that about whether you see the UK has very low replacement rates in terms of its benefits, and many people talk about how that results in worse matches in the job market. So do you actually see, you know, either whether you've done this research in France or through the OECD, that places that do have better sort of contributory welfare systems do have better productivity improvements because of job mobility? Thank you.
Thanks. So on rent sharing and heterogeneity net across different workers, we have a paper on the gender wage gap, where we basically look at differences in rent sharing between men and women and how this contributes to the gender wage gap. And you basically see that we have very similar results to CART in a paper for Portugal. Basically shows that for every dollar of rents, only 90% of that goes to women relative to men. And so it was a very consistent pattern across countries. On the second question, so we actually just completing a literature survey on the role of UI for productivity. And we're also hoping to look at that empirically with our linked employment data. the reading of the literature is not very encouraging when it comes to productivity or rather re-employment outcomes. The problem is that UI tends to increase the duration of employment, and that in itself has a negative effect on re-employment wages, and so that tends to offset the positive effect that you might want to hope to get on match quality. So the evidence for that is unfortunately quite weak.
Thank you. And if we could just thank our panelists for the presentation.